Welcome to our final session for Friday. Yeah, I guess we go from fracking to Dodd-Franking in our final session. Right, from constructive to destructive. So we wanted to talk about the Dodd-Frank bill. The title of the session here is The Economic and Political Significance of the Dodd-Frank Act. And in 3 years, we've had the results of that massive regulation of the banking industry, and we have three excellent panelists to comment on that. Here we have the Dodd-Frank bill, as many of you know, 2,319 pages long. And I don't think it's that spellbinding prose that Ann McElhaney was wanting us to put forth and attack Hollywood with. The Dodd-Franking bill is very important, though. The content of that act has enormous impact on American society. Regulators are charged, not Congress, but the regulators, charged with making new law, making new regulations. These have a dramatic impact. Contrary in many ways to the founders, if you look at James Madison, he talked often about the importance of having clear and predictable laws for a stable and prosperous society. Clear and predictable laws. That isn't what we have, of course, with Dodd-Frank. And also the whole idea of outsourcing power to unelected officials. We have three panelists here who are going to do a fine job of explaining the Dodd-Frank bill and the consequences of it. We have our first panelist, Gene Epstein. Gene writes for Barron's and has been doing so for over 20 years. His column is called Economic Beat. He started the column almost 20 years ago. Gene also has an important book. Econo-Spinning is the name of it. Econo-Spinning, subtitled, How to Read Between the Lines When the Media Manipulate the Numbers. The book was published in 2006, is still available. And before joining Barron's, Gene worked for 13 years at the New York Stock Exchange, mainly as a senior economist. Gene has taught economics at the City University of New York and also St. John's University. He holds a master's degree in economics from the New School and also a bachelor's in history from Brandeis University. Gene has made numerous appearances on Fox News, CNBC, and the BBC television network, and has lectured around the world. The title of Gene's topic today is What Caused the 2008 Crisis? Welcome, Gene.
So, are we up and running with my first slide? Yeah, go ahead. Want the title up there? First of all, let me apologize for the somewhat rough language. Crapitalism is my neologism for crony capitalism, and I think it works well. The language is not going to get any filthier than that, so rest assured it's going to be fine. This is actually the second time I've been hosted by Hillsdale College, a beacon of freedom and learning. The first time I actually went out to Hillsdale and was delighted to meet with the students. It would only be for Hillsdale College that I would agree to do a 19-minute version of a talk I've delivered a number of times that takes usually about 55 minutes. It helps, I believe, that really the causes of the failure of capitalism, the causes of the Great Recession are pretty easy, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. I would say by analogy that I could respectfully debate a lot of people on the causes of the Great Depression. The causes of the Great Recession, however, the financial bubble, are much simpler. The evidence is so overwhelming that if we were to debate the issue, it would really be pretty much around the margins. I also maybe want to save my colleagues the trouble about talking about Dodd-Frank by pointing out very simply that Christopher Dodd and Barney Frank, who co-authored the bill, were clearly major crony capitalist players in the game. And so this would almost be like calling a bill to promote free markets the Marx and Lenin bill to promote free markets. It's really totally ironic. It's almost all you have to know, but they will enlighten you, I'm sure. Well, let me go forward and just, I'm pressing next, and it's not working. Next. Next. Sorry. No? Yeah, next. Okay. Yeah, we know what the Great Recession was, the longest and deepest contraction of the U.S. economy since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The rate of unemployment nearly doubled to more than 10%. Now, I said it's a failure of capitalism, so first let me establish what capitalism is. It's a private enterprise system of profit and loss. Profits encourage risk-taking, losses encourage prudence. Very important to stress that capitalism is not just about profits. Very, very importantly, it's also about loss. Unimpeded prices determine profit and loss in the capitalist system. But under crony capitalism, unfortunately, the system that tends to dominate what goes on and certainly dominates the housing market, profits stay privatized, but losses are absorbed by government. Prices, including the price of credit, are distorted by government intervention, and economic activity, as in housing, is actively engaged in by government. Now, two key examples, two key players in our drama in the capitalist system are Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They were government-sponsored enterprises traded on the New York Stock Exchange. They went bankrupt. They went into receivership. They're beginning to get resuscitated by the government most recently, however. So they will come up. Now, the two main factors in the crony capitalist system that caused the problem. The enabling factor was the central bank's negative interest rate policy from 2002 to 2005. The propelling factor that without that enabling factor, we might have had a mild recession. The propelling factor, however, was the U.S. government's housing policy that began in 1992. Now, this chart almost tells the whole story. It shows you the inflation-adjusted price of homes from 1890 through 2011. It shows you that, in fact, there was a big price decline in the 1930s. I guess that, unfortunately, that's what the measure cannot be seen, but it's just an index number, and the number that it tends to hover around is 100. It begins at 100, it goes below 100, it goes up to 100. So, in fact, by the way, the inflation-adjusted house price did not rise by very much. But now notice what happened starting in 2000, starting just around the time that the government's policies really began to kick in. There was a price spike. There was a price bubble. We know, at least after the fact, that it was a price bubble. We certainly knew even during the fact that it was happening. The price rose and then collapsed. And when it collapsed, a lot of mortgages went underwater. A lot of mortgages that were owned just with 2 to 3% down payment, sometimes with 1% down payment. Think of it. That's like buying stocks on margin in 1929 with very low down payments. And the private sector mortgages, private sector got in late. The Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA got in early and started to push up that bubble. And then the private sector got encouraged to get on the bandwagon. They came in toward the top of the bubble so that they were hit first. The Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHA mortgages were more toward the bottom of the bubble, so they were hit later. And that's, of course, a part of the myth of what went on, that we're supposed to think that it was all private sector because the private sector mortgages were more vulnerable. But in fact, of course, it was all pushed by a very conscious policy of government. Now, what was that policy? First, I want to show you the negative interest rates of the Federal Reserve, the interest rate on federal funds, which the Federal Reserve targets, and minus the inflation rate. And in 2002, 2003, 2004, it was negative. Now, who in his right mind would lend money at a rate of interest that's below the rate of inflation? Only the government is foolish enough to do that. Only the government can do that. And so it's very clear that if you're borrowing money short short term at negative interest rates, that's going to be an enabling factor that's going to push up the bubble. Now, before I leave the Federal Reserve, because we want to get to the propelling factor, I want to quote from the current Fed chairman, he's soon going to be outgoing, Ben Bernanke, who stated in front of a crowd of people, and this paper was published online, that economists who have generally investigated the issue have generally found that, based on historical relationships, only a small portion of the increase in house prices earlier this decade can be attributed to the stance of U.S. monetary policy. He's trying to let the Federal Reserve off the hook, in other words. And he's doing that, by the way, because he was present at the time. He was Alan Greenspan's Federal Reserve governor, who was pushing that interest rate policy. But notice I put a number 12 there because Bernanke actually footnoted those economists who investigated the issue. And strangely, in the age of the internet, you can look things up very easily. And you find that on EndNote 2, he says, see, for example, Jarrett, Kosinski, and Smets, two economists, and then you read their paper, and what do they write? We find that monetary policy has significant effects on housing investment and house prices, and that easy monetary policy designed to stave off perceived risks of deflation in 2004 has contributed to the boom in the housing market in 2002 and 2005. We live in such a benighted society that even in the age of the internet, our Federal Reserve chairman has the chutzpah, that's a Yiddish word, you probably have heard it, to actually make a statement and source it, and then it turns out that the source said exactly the opposite of what he was claiming. So that's the intellectual environment in which we live. It's, my God, as a columnist, I would have had to go to the library to look that article up. It's very easy to find it online. So let's leave the Federal Reserve and talk about what else happened, the propelling factor. Now, this is a quote from a guy named Raghu Rajan, who actually was very prescient about the bubble. And he's in a movie called Inside Job, an Oscar-winning film that was truly terrible, misquoted Raghu Rajan. But Raghu Rajan, I think, set the tone when he talked about the role of the private sector. He said, the banking sector did not decide out of the goodness of its heart to extend mortgages to poor people. Politicians did that, and they would have taken great umbrage if the regulator stood in the way of more housing credit. I mean, that too says it all in a way. Obviously, it was not a failure of regulation. They would have, the government wanted this to happen, and they were going to stop any regulator who prevented it. This is a slightly long quote, but it's 1992. It set the stage. It was the Housing and Community Development Act which launched the situation. And notice what they're saying, that the purpose of the affordable housing goals is to facilitate the development in both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, those two crony capitalist organizations, of an ongoing business effort that will be fully integrated into their products, cultures, and day-to-day operations to service the mortgage financing needs of low and moderate income persons, racial minorities, and inner city residents. Now, again, those people were the ones who were truly shafted. They were preyed upon by the government. You cannot blame them for being told that for practically no down payment, and all you have to do, literally in certain cases, is provide food stamps, the food stamps you get as financial backing, and then you're given a house to own. They were fooled by the government. They were fooled mainly by Bill Clinton. I asked somebody who wrote a book about the situation. Who do you think is the most culpable? Who do you think is the most indictable over this situation? Because when the Academy Award was won for the Inside Job by a guy named, I forget his first name, his last name is Ferguson. He said, nobody's been indicted yet. Well, she said Bill Clinton probably, because when Bill Clinton talked about how this is not going to cost taxpayers a dime, that he wanted the home ownership rate pushed to an all-time high by the end of the century. He set goals for HUD to impose on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This was his dream. And again, Bill Clinton simply did not know what profit and loss were all about. He did not know what he was doing. But hopefully he could gain wisdom about it now and apologize, which he's not going to do. Now, that's the price. This chart shows the same price chart and then the rise in the homeownership rate, just showing that goal of Clinton's was what was pushing up the bubble. The red line is the homeownership rate, which went up and then now has fallen, and the blue line is that same price bubble. But of course, in a way, a better chart would be to show the number of mortgages with a down payment of 3% or less that exploded and that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were buying. Now, this is Paul Krugman, who you may have heard of. I want to set up a quote of his and then point out what really went on. He's talking about the right's answer is to claim not just the government did it, but that it caused the crisis by its attempts to reduce inequality, exclamation point. It's kind of a master stroke in an evil way. Well, the government did do it, and they were concerned about inequality. This is President Bush, who picked up the ball from President Clinton. The goal is everybody who wants to own a home has got a shot at doing so. That's everybody. It doesn't matter how much you earn. The home ownership rate is down to about 65% in this country. It's about stable. Mostly, of course, it's among older people. The problem is, he said, that we have what we call a home ownership gap in America. So indeed, President Bush was concerned about inequality of home ownership. Amazing realization for Paul Krugman. The unthinkable that a Republican president can talk in this way. By the way, to George W. Bush's credit, this has not been promoted very much, but in his memoir about his administration, he has admitted that he made an egregious mistake. I actually haven't read the complete passage, so I don't know if he recognizes that he picked up the ball from Bill Clinton and pushed all this. But he has at least owned up to a little bit to what he did. Now he says he's proud to report that Fannie Mae has heard the call, and as I understand, it's about. So again, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were called upon to create these mortgages and to push them, and then the private sector got on the bandwagon. The private sector, by the way, who got their arms twisted in different ways as well, but they were in it for the money. They were part of the crony capitalist system too. Angelo Mazzillo, by the way, was if you've ever heard of him, the head of Countrywide. I don't think the man really knew anything much about mortgages. He spoke at Harvard once, and he talked about how it's very nice that 80% of those people who are being given these mortgages are paying them back. He was talking about a 20% default rate. And if he knew anything about mortgages, he would know that the interest rate was just not covering that default rate. So, indeed, I don't let them off the hook. Well, I'm going to get into deregulation. How much more time do I have? I do. Okay, well, that's not bad. Deregulation did it. That's the argument, that deregulation did it. There's no question that had the government told the banking system, you've got to load up on equity. You need a much bigger cushion for all the risks that we are persuading you to take, that there would not have been a banking crisis. That is true. We call it a sin of omission on the part of the government. That was not a failure of deregulation, because the Federal Reserve had the power to say that to the banks. You need more cushion, you need more equity in your balance sheet in order to protect yourself. But that's exactly the opposite of what Chris Dodd and Barney Frank and Bill Clinton and George W. Bush wanted. They wanted the banks to be issuing these mortgages. But now when you talk about deregulation, which is what most of our liberal friends are going to tell you, or what Inside Job is all about, then what did deregulation consist of? The elimination of Regulation Q, which was simply the limit on interest rates that banks could charge. That was a good thing. Banks had to pay more interest rates because when inflation hit, they had to pay a higher rate of interest in order to be competitive. The elimination of restrictions on branch banking, that was also a good thing. It's a little known fact that for the first 100, 150 years of the Republic, it was very difficult for a bank to branch with another bank. That was state laws. This was another part of the crony capitalist system. A local bank liked that kind of protection. Banks enjoyed it because then they had a local monopoly. It made them very vulnerable. It created a lot of banking crises because if a bank is just dependent on the local wheat market for all its loans or the local economy, then it's very vulnerable. But the banking system was more or less in league with the states, and they enjoyed that. Banks would naturally branch and diversify their risk. So there was a limit, the lifting of the elimination of restrictions on branch banking. That that helped. That helped stabilize the system. But then there was also the partial elimination of Glass-Steagall restriction on commercial banks affiliating with investment banks. That's often raised as an issue, and that too is absurd. Well, let me try the next, the partial repeal of Glass-Steagall. It said, which it kept Wall Street and mainstream banks walled off from each other, and this allowed FDIC-insured banks whose deposits were guaranteed to engage in highly risky business. It was clearly absurd, the idea that Glass-Steagall made any difference at all. We wish that the banks had done more of investment banking. What is investment banking? It's a relatively low-risk practice of underwriting stocks and bonds. If they had done more of it, it would have helped. And in fact, the partial repeal of Glass-Steagall helped stabilize the system because it allowed mergers between Merrill Lynch and Bank of America. It allowed, I forget the other merger that took place, Morgan Stanley merged. It was actually stabilizing. So this idea of this very highly regulated industry being in any way caused that in being in any way destabilized by deregulation is simply nonsense. There's the Glamm-Leach-Bliley thing was also about that was the law that permitted branching, and then we have the New York Times saying that isn't entirely blameless. For one thing, the mergers it encouraged left banks with more capital to invest. Some of the capital ended up in that diluted subprime mortgage market. Well, that's a very lame statement. The reason why the capital ended up in that subprime mortgage market was because the government was essentially trying to push the home ownership rate to 70%, a rate that it could not sustain because it was selling mortgages to people who couldn't afford them. And when the bubble burst and prices began to fail, those mortgages failed by the ton, and as those mortgages failed by the ton, it upended the banking system, and it caused a freezing of credit, which then spilled over into other sectors of the economy, and then we had the Great Recession. Again, the broad outlines of the story of any economic downturn that I have ever read about, there are a few economic downturns where the facts and the basic stage setting, the basic, very explicit involvement of two presidents in this bubble that burst. It's almost, I know of no situation in economic history that is as clear as this one. I'll yield to my colleagues now. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Gene, for that helpful commentary on the housing crisis. Our next speaker is Nicole Gelinas. She's with the Manhattan Institute. She's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and contributes writing as the editor of City Journal. She writes on urban economics, finance, municipal and corporate finance, and business issues. In a sense, she's the answer to that question that sometimes we hear: what can you do with a degree in English literature? All of that she does. Nicole is a chartered financial analyst and member of the New York Society of Securities Analysts. Her most recent book is entitled After the Fall. The book is subtitled Saving Capitalism from Wall Street and Washington. Nicole has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and dozens of other publications. She graduated from Tulane University with a bachelor's degree in English literature. She and her husband live in Manhattan. Nicole?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Bert. Just like Gene, I am a Hillsdale recidivist, so I'm happy to be back for my second time speaking before the Free Market Forum, and thank you to Anita as well. Well, Dodd-Frank may or may not be unconstitutional. I don't want to give away the answer because I know Todd hasn't spoken yet. But there's a more practical problem with the law, and that is that it doesn't work, and it was designed not to work. what was the problem that Dodd-Frank was supposed to fix? It was supposed to fix the problem of too big to fail. It does not do that, and it will never end too big to fail. And indeed, the practical problem of laws being designed not to work is a part of the problem that we're seeing with Obamacare as well. Dodd-Frank and Obamacare have quite a bit in common. Since Obamacare has been in the news so much the last couple of weeks, I'll thread some comparisons to Obamacare into my discussion about Dodd-Frank. The two laws have several things in common. For starters, as Bert noted, both of the laws are far too long and far too complex. Dodd-Frank is 849 pages in the official legislated version of the law. Obamacare clocks in at 906 pages. This is a new phenomenon. The 1965 Act that created Medicare was 138 pages, not 906 pages. On the financial side, the Securities Act of 1933, which was a cornerstone of financial regulation for 5 decades until it began to be eroded in the 1980s, was just 93 pages. And the Glass-Steagall Act that Jean talked about is another 1933 law that dealt with financial regulation. That was 53 pages. The 1934 Securities Exchange Act, another part of our Depression-era financial laws, despite decades and decades of amendments, is still only 371 pages, still less than half the size of Dodd-Frank. And in fact, just talking about the length of the law understates the case a bit. Dodd-Frank was not really a law, but as Louise Bennett of the Cato Institute likes to say, it was a set of mandates for regulators. Dodd-Frank directed regulators from the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, controller of the currency, to write 398 separate rules. And so far, regulators have written more than 18,789 pages of text to make up these rules, and they're only 40% done. Moreover, they have missed the majority of the deadlines that Congress set for them more than 3 years ago when President Obama signed the bill into law. It's not only rule writing that makes it difficult to know what this law will really do when it's finally being enforced. It's also bureaucracy creating that is adding to the delay. And I'll just read you some of the new acronyms that Dodd-Frank gave us. We've got a new FSOC, a Financial Stability Oversight Council. We have a new OFR, the Office of Financial Research. We have a new IAC, Investor Advisory Committee. We have a new RAC, the Research and Analysis Center. We have a new FRF, a Financial Research Fund. We have a new OLA, Orderly Liquidation Authority. We've got an OLF as well as an OLA, Orderly Liquidation Fund. We've got OMWI, which is Office of Minority and Women Inclusion. Actually, there are several of those now. We've got Office of Financial Education, Office of Service Member Affairs, Office of Financial Protection for Older Americans, Consumer Advisory Board, and a Private Education Loan Ombudsman. None of these things existed before Dodd-Frank was made into law. So every one of these agencies or collections of people needs someone to be in charge. They need staff and so forth. Now, it would be one thing if we were going through all of this trouble to create something that would do the job. But there's a growing bipartisan consensus that Dodd-Frank is not working. Don't ask me, ask the Treasury Secretary. Jacob Lew went before Congress in May, and he said that I think the challenge is now to make sure that we know that these can work, he said about the provisions of the law. The operation issues are not insignificant, he said. And then somewhat obliquely, Liu concluded that we are still determining how to set the levels in various areas so that in the end we'll be able to say that too big to fail has ended. Now, this is 3 years, well, in May it was nearly 3 years since the law had been signed, but yet the Treasury Secretary was still not able to go before Congress and say that the law was working as intended, that we had ended too big to fail. You look on the Democratic side of Congress, Elizabeth Warren, the new Democratic senator from Massachusetts, she has announced what she calls a new Glass-Steagall bill, a 30-page bill for financial regulation. Her doing this is a sign that even the left parts of the left think that the law is not working. It's easy to say that, and this is true of Obamacare too, that Dodd-Frank had to be very long and complicated because we are dealing with a complex and difficult problem. And so to deal with a complicated problem, you have to have a complicated solution. That's a mistake. There was a book review of Judge Richard Posner's new book in the New York Times last week, and he wrote in the book, as the Times quoted, that judges are escaping from complexity in more complexity. And he didn't think that was a good thing, and it's not. It was very simple to fix the problem of 2008, the too big to fail problem. What should the government have done? What did the government need to do? The biggest thing has to do with capital. What is capital? A financial institution borrows a certain percentage of the money that it holds on its balance sheet, and then it goes out in turn and lends that money to people or institutions or invests it in another way. But a financial firm has to have a certain percentage of non-borrowed money as well. And that's for the same reason that a person shouldn't borrow all of the money that they invested in their home or in another asset. If you borrow 100% of the value of your home, if you have to sell your home suddenly and there's a market downturn, even if it goes down 2% or 5% in value, you are not able to pay back the debt that you owe. You want to have a little bit of an equity cushion, a non-borrowed cash cushion, to give yourself a little bit of flexibility to absorb a loss. That's the same thing with a financial firm. If a financial firm borrows all of the money that it has to invest in assets, if the market of value of those assets goes down by just a couple of percentage points, financial institution is insolvent. If it's lucky, no one will notice that it's insolvent. If not, it's going to be liquidated and go out of business. Having a higher and a consistent capital requirement for financial institutions would have done the trick for 3 reasons. One, right now, the government's capital requirements are very inconsistent. So if you are a financial firm and you want to borrow money to do what the government wants you to do, that is, if you're a financial firm and you are approving new mortgages, or you are lending money to the government itself in the form of purchasing treasury bonds, the government is very happy with these activities. And so the government says you don't have to have a lot of non-borrowed money behind these activities. By contrast, if you're doing something that the government doesn't want you to do, or that the government doesn't care about, an investment in a private equity venture, you have to put a lot more non-borrowed money behind those investments. So what does the government's policy do? By saying, we want you to invest in these things and we will give you a break on your capital if you do this, the government encourages the whole financial system to make the same mistake all at once. The financial system can withstand different companies making different mistakes at different times, even companies going bankrupt, but it can't withstand whole financial system effectively making the same mistake at the same time. That's what we saw in 2008. The second reason is that if firms had more capital, firms would be more likely to be able to go bankrupt without endangering the rest of the economy. You have a higher cushion for failures, and so you can allow for these failures without taking down the rest of the economy. And the third reason is really just the combination of these other two reasons. If investors knew that banks could fail, investors would be much more careful about lending their money to these large financial institutions. This is what Jean said about loss or the risk of loss encouraging prudence. Lenders, large institutional lenders that provide the money that large financial firms use, they know that the system still can't withstand financial failures. They know then that there will be bailouts in the future, and they still lend money at artificially low rates to these large financial firms. So what has the government done? It didn't do that. Instead, it asked regulators to make all of these new rules. And what are the results of this rulemaking? Just as we are learning that Obamacare is not working the way the president thought it would work, or the president said he thought it would work, Dodd-Frank is not working the way it's supposed to work either. Just take one rule, the Volcker Rule. This was a signature part of Dodd-Frank, named after the former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker. The rule was meant so that if you're a large financial firm and you benefit from taxpayer subsidies, like FDIC insurance of your deposits, you are not supposed to use that subsidy to invest in risky ventures, speculative short-term bets in particular markets. Now, the first problem with this is it sends a very bad signal. Things like FDIC insurance are not supposed to help banks. They're supposed to help the customers of the banks, and they're not supposed to prohibit failure. They are supposed to facilitate failure. If the bank fails and small depositors get their money back, that makes it much easier politically for the bank to fail. So by saying that the subsidy is benefiting the banks, not the customers, we are further muddling how to fix too big to fail. And the other problem is that the regulators just can't figure out how to do this. What is a risky bet that should be prohibited? If a bank buys a collection of bonds because it thinks it's going to have a customer for those bonds next week, is that unacceptable speculation with taxpayer money? Or is that just good, solid business? You know, if you sell apples, you buy apples because you think people are going to buy your apples. Is that the same thing, or is this something that financial firms should not be doing? So after thousands and thousands of pages written, they still have not come up with an enforceable version of this rule. And Chairman Volcker went on TV and he blamed the regulators and said it shouldn't take them 3 years to make a rule, that there's still too much regulatory overlap. And, you know, some of that is true, but also they can't do very much with a law that was very badly written. Now, the bigger problem, and the problem with Obamacare too, is that why do we have a law that is like this, the way that it is? This is a symptom of a much bigger problem, the unwillingness of either party to level with the voters. You know, President Obama never said up front, in order for everyone to have health insurance, younger, healthier people are going to have to pay more, so that older, unhealthier people are going to have to pay less. Everyone is finding out about this now and are very surprised. The same thing is true with Dodd-Frank. If we had financial regulation that worked, if we really did end too big to fail, the political and economic effects would not be good in the short term. If financial firms were no longer too big to fail, they wouldn't be able to borrow as cheaply. They couldn't lend money to people as cheaply so that they could purchase and refinance mortgages. That means housing prices would fall. If you're a young person looking to buy a house, you won't be able to pay as much. If you're looking to sell a house to this foolish young person, you're going to have to sell it for less than you expected to. Obama would not have been reelected if we had ended too big to fail and mortgage rates and the price of other types of credit was as high, or were as high as it should be. And another one difference between Dodd-Frank and Obamacare is not a very good difference. The problem is people can see right now that Obamacare is not working the way it was supposed to. If that continues, and if people, once they've got their insurance through these exchanges, they find out, I can't see the doctor that I wanted to see. I've got a 6-month wait because the doctor has thousands of new patients. They're going to be upset. They'll be able to see that it's not working. With Dodd-Frank, it's much more subtle. It's hard for people to know that an artificially distorted financial system is still kind of coloring everything we do. And the long-term effects of that are not very good. We have a financial system that continues to compete with the real economy rather than support the real economy because of these artificial subsidies. If you are an investor, you'd rather lend your money to a bank where it's safe than lend your money to a venture that does contain some risk because it is not implicitly subsidized by the government. And then there are other distortions as well. Far too much of our capital still goes into the housing sector. People put their investments into their house instead of into companies and markets that might create more jobs, might fix some of the imbalances that we have in the economy with Americans still consuming too much and Chinese and other parts of the world still producing too much. These things still exist for a lot of reasons, but in part because Dodd-Frank didn't do the job of making sure that financial firms are subject to free market discipline as other types of companies are, or other types of businesses are. What's the end of all of this? What eventually would end too big to fail is politics and good politics and people simply not accepting another round of bailouts, whether it's 2 years from now, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, and the party in power realizing it is just toxic for us to continue to bail out these large financial firms. And we see some of this in Congress. In addition to the Elizabeth Warren bill, David Vitter, Republican senator of Louisiana, has a bill to address the continuing problem of too big to fail. Savvy politicians know that this is still a problem and it's still a political problem, and it's a vulnerability for presidential candidates going into the next election, just as it was for the last two. A good politician who can understand and grasp that could do very well. Rick Santorum did well in the primary, not only because of social issues in 2008 or 2012, but because he was also the only candidate who was talking about the problem of Wall Street and too big to fail. Mitt Romney never even seemed to notice that people were still thinking about this. Whether it's a Democrat or a Republican the next time around, someone who understands that Americans are not against capitalism, they're not against free markets, they're not against rich people, they're just against a system for large financial institutions and the people who work there, and a different system for everybody else. They understand that that is an unfairness. It's really only Washington and Wall Street that maybe understand that that's not fair, but they like things the way that they are. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you, Nicole, for helping us understand why Dodd-Frank is too big to succeed, maybe. Our final speaker is Todd Zywicki. And Todd is George Mason University Foundation Professor of Law at George Mason University School of Law. And George Mason has a wonderful law school and econ department. Hillsdale College sends a lot of its graduates to George Mason. Todd is also the co-editor of Supreme Court Economic Review. From 2003 to 2004, he served as director of the Office of Policy Planning at the Federal Trade Commission. He has testified over a dozen times before Congress on issues of bankruptcy law and consumer credit. He's a frequent commentator on legal and business issues in the print and broadcast media. He has also taught at Vanderbilt University Law School, Georgetown University Law Center, Boston College Law School, and Mississippi College School of Law. He is the author of over 70 articles in leading law reviews and peer-reviewed economic journals. Todd received his law degree from the University of Virginia. He earned a master's degree in economics from Clemson University and his undergraduate degree from Dartmouth College, and he's a frequent commentator on issues related to upholding standards at Dartmouth College. Welcome, Todd Zywicki.
Thanks, Bert. And unlike my two co-panelists, I'm not a recidivist, but I do feel like teaching at George Mason Law School that Hillsdale's always seemed like sort of our sister undergrad institution in some sense, because we're kind of a unique place at George Mason Law School as well. And so it's a real pleasure for me to be here, and I really enjoyed both Jean and Nicole's remarks, which I thought were terrific and very insightful, and I agree with pretty much all of it. So my task is to talk about Dodd-Frank and the Constitution, and there are a couple of legal cases pending, but rather than talk about the legal cases, I'm going to talk about it in a more conceptual sort of way to think about Dodd-Frank and the Constitution. Now, in Federalist 51, my favorite Federalist paper, a comment so geeky that one could only utter it in a room full of other professors. My favorite Federalist paper. Madison talks about the fundamental challenge of constitutional architecture, and he says, "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control of the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions." Now, this insight that Madison has, you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself, I think is the fundamental insight into constitutional government. There is no solution to that. It is simply a trade-off, right? Which is that allowing the government to control the governed basically means we need to protect the government from factionalism, in Madison's terms, right? What we would call special interests today. And to some extent, we want to give our political leaders some degree of independence to protect them from the influence of factions, of special interests, whether majoritarian or minoritarian. But at the same time, after we create independence for that, on the other hand, we've got to oblige the government to control itself, which is we don't want to have a king who's completely unaccountable because he'll indulge his own preferences rather than the reason that we have it. So we create a constitutional architecture that has three branches composed of people selected by different means, the president by the Electoral College, two houses of Congress selected in different ways. Most importantly, I think the original Senate, which was appointed by state legislatures. Don't get me going on the 17th Amendment. And then the independent judiciary, right? So the idea is to kind of muddle through and come up with a balance between a legitimate Republican government on one hand and overarching tyranny and control by our governors on the other. Now, Dodd-Frank takes a very clear view on this. Dodd-Frank says we are coming down on the side of allowing the governors to do whatever they want to, essentially. And as Jean portrayed, I think very nicely summarized what I would say is this is based, the logic of Dodd-Frank, which creates these super independent bureaucratic mechanisms, is premised on this particular narrative of the financial crisis, the political narrative that Jean described, right? Which is that the big banks corrupted the political system. They repealed Glass-Steagall. They allowed branch banking. They deregulated consumer financial markets and that sort of thing. Now, leave aside the fact that virtually every single sentence of that is untrue, as Jean told us. That's the narrative that lies behind Dodd-Frank. And the lesson they draw from it is that means we need to insulate all of our political leaders, all of our governors, from political oversight. Right? And so that's what we see sort of running through Dodd-Frank. The second thing they say is that that capitalism is inherently unstable and everybody's inherently bad, right? The bankers and that sort of thing. So we need to have discretion. The government needs to have discretion to chase down the bad guys, to respond to emergencies as they arise and that sort of thing. The lesson they take away from the financial crisis. And we see this riddled all throughout Dodd-Frank, right? We see it in the Financial Stability Oversight Commission that Nicole mentioned, which allows the government to declare certain institutions to be systemically risky based on a very vague definition and no articulated standards, just some degree of interconnectedness. Interestingly enough, you can challenge being called systemically risky, but you have to challenge it within 30 days, and in that challenge, you're not allowed to raise any statutory or constitutional objections. Judges are specifically not allowed to consider statutory or constitutional objections to being declared systemically risky. We've got the Orderly Liquidation Authority, which has this hair trigger process by which if you're declared insolvent by the government, you have 24 hours, not just to sue, but to get a judge to stop the process. And if anybody, and it has to be done in secret, and if anybody hears about it, you can go to jail. If you tell anybody that the government is shutting you down and putting you into liquidation, right? Again, no statutory or constitutional issues. Of course, the great example of this is the CFPB, Professor Elizabeth Warren's creation. It's inside the Federal Reserve, but it's not subject to the Federal Reserve. They have a single director, appointed 5-year term, removable only for cause. They got a guaranteed budget. They get 12% of the expenditures of the Federal Reserve every year. No questions asked. They don't have to go to Congress for appropriations. Give you a sense, in 2013, that's $597 million that are given to the CFPB, no questions asked. And you'll be happy to know that when the government shut down a few weeks ago, the CFPB just kept on trucking because they don't get appropriations from the government. So the CFPB was still open when the government shut down. Give you a sense of $597 million, that's double the size of the Federal Trade Commission, which is one of our major antitrust authorities and also does the rest of consumer protection for the government. Now, to be sure, and I don't want to leave aside the fact, rent seeking by big banks is a big problem. I agree with that. I mean, I know I couldn't go up to Washington and get $700 billion of taxpayer money, and I don't think anybody else here could, right? I don't think that was the explanation for deregulation, though, and I certainly don't think that unconstrained government power is the response to that. So so let's look back and examine the progressive myth about why we deregulated the financial system and the rest of the economy in the 70s, and that'll help us to understand, once we understand the reality, what really happened. So what really happened? Well, we know what happened is we created the modern administrative state, beginning with the Progressive era, excelling during the New Deal era, and it looked just like the kind of dream world that's created by Dodd-Frank, right? A bunch of unaccountable bureaucrats running around, running the economy without just doing what they thought was the right thing to do. Well, what happened? Well, we found by the 1970s that our bureaucrats were inflicting upon us economic stagnation, declines in entrepreneurship. Japan was eating our lunch. Does this history ring a bell with anybody? Because it doesn't ring a bell with anybody in Washington. So at least some people remember what this was. And also we discovered that interest groups, capture theory of government was called, were basically manipulating the bureaucracies and the halls of government for their own purposes. So the response, which was led originally by Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter, was to begin deregulating and updating some of these administrative agencies. We abolished the Civil Aeronautics Board, the Interstate Commerce Commission, we reformed the FTC, and those sorts of things. And that's the real history, right? Which is unaccountable government bureaucrats ruin the economy, is what I thought we learned during the 1970s. Dodd-Frank, however, is as if they took everything that they ever learned, frozen in amber in 1974, right, and then thawed it out again in 2008, as if they didn't learn anything that happened during the period in the intervening period. So I think of Dodd-Frank as the revenge of Richard Nixon, right? Nixon coming back from the grave to create an administrative agency, right? The other thing that we discovered is this thicket, this web of complex bureaucratic behavior is really kind of, that's in statutes that are thick and complicated, as we've been talking about, are really, That's the engine of crony capitalism in the economy, right? The engine of crony capitalism is discretion, the ability of the government to pick winners and losers. And so, for instance, a paper just came out from the Mercatus Center recently that noted that your likelihood of whether or not you got bailout money as a bank was very strongly related to how much lobbying, what your lobbying expenditures were in Washington, for instance, right? When you've got these kind of thicket of rules, it's not the little guys, it's not the small startup business who can weave their way through this thicket. It's the big guys, the connected guys, the guys who can hire the lawyers and the lobbyists in order to get it done. Why is the tax code so long? It's not because special interests are arguing for lower rates, right? The tax code is that thick because they're lobbying for loopholes, right? And that's what I think is interesting about Nicole's observation about Dodd-Frank being a system that's set up to fail, right? Let me give you an example. It has to do with qualified mortgages. Now, qualified mortgage is a rule that was put out by the CFPB, completely nonsensical rule because it doesn't get to the underlying point that Gene mentioned, which was the lack of equity that people have in their homes. But what it's supposed to do is identify safe mortgages based on ability to pay. So it looks at things like what your income, what percentage of your income is going to pay your debt, what your FICO score is, and that sort of thing, right? So over here you got one logic, right, which is a consumer protection logic of not making loans that people can't afford, right? FICO score, income, that sort of thing. Over here, though, the CFPB has another authority, which is the authority to enforce fair lending laws, right? And they've said that they want to use disparate impact, which is that if you see a different sort of disparity for race or sex or something like that, we're going to assume that you're discriminating. Now, just assume for the sake of argument that, say, FICO scores have some relationship to demographic impact, right? So that if you only make loans to people above a certain FICO score, there's some possibility that your lending pool is going to end up being out of compliance with what they think of in terms of disparate impact. You follow the point? How can you make a loan in that world, right? They've basically set up a system where if you make only qualified mortgages, you're exposing yourself to liability over here, right? How can you do that? You can only do that if you know how to send the right guys and the right lawyers and the right lobbyists into the CFPB and massage them, right, to figure out how to make this work. Oh, and you'll be happy to know that one of the guys who helped set up the CFPB has, in fact, now set up a consulting business that'll tell you how to make qualified mortgages. If anybody needs that information, he can tell you how to weave through that thicket, right? So let's talk about the CFPB for a few minutes. Now, to reconcile this balance, we've kind of, that Madison identifies, we've come to two different ways of creating bureaucratic structures that are more or less constitutional, right? The first is the executive agency. An executive agency is an agency where basically the cabinet department where the secretary serves at the pleasure of the president, right? So if you don't like what they're doing, you think they're doing a bad job, the president can just fire them. The mechanism is political accountability to the president. All right. The other thing we've come up with is an independent agency, and this has an uneasy fit within the Constitution, but we've kind of gotten used to it. This is an agency that is headed by a bipartisan commission, usually like 5 people, right, a mix of Democrats and Republicans, subject to congressional oversight. And what we have there instead of accountability is sort of internal deliberation, right, the ability of a bipartisan committee for people to dissent, to create a record for judicial review, and that sort of thing. Now, what's interesting about the CFPB, it is neither. It is neither. It is neither an executive agency, even though it has a single director, because the president can't remove him. He serves for a 5-year term, removable for cause. To be confirmed by the Senate. Now, the amazing thing is, really the only check that Congress had was the ability to confirm the director of the CFPB. But as you may remember, that was even too much because the president did an illegal recess appointment of the CFPB director. And that's a case that's going to be heard in the Supreme Court. It's also not an independent agency because there's only one director, right? It doesn't have, Congress has no budgetary oversight to be able to do it. It's not accountable to the Fed, so it's not really a bureau within the Fed because the Fed can't review the things that the CFPB does. And this one guy, the director, but gets to appoint every single person within the agency unilaterally, right? In fact, I've called it an independent agency inside another independent agency, right, inside the Fed. And so what has the record been of the CFPB so far? Well, I'll give you one example. You may have seen the Wall Street Journal yesterday talking about this thing they're doing with auto dealers, which is auto dealers are specifically exempted from CFPB's oversight, a pure special interest carve-out, but a very clear one in the statute. Nevertheless, even that little portion of the universe is too much for the CFPB to keep their hands off of. So what they're doing is they're going to the banks that supply money to auto dealers to make loans and basically telling the banks, we are going to hold you responsible for any discriminatory lending patterns based on disparate impact that we see the auto dealers making with money that you supply to them, right? They're basically turning the banks into private enforcers of the federal government. Now, how can they do that? Well, that's the reality that we live in, right? Which is that the banks are in bed with the government. They basically work at the suffrage of the government. And so as a result, that's actually working, which is that's actually working. The banks are cracking down on the auto dealers who are doing that. And that's what we start to see in this world of Dodd-Frank. Right? In a world in which it's impossible to comply with all of the laws, in a world with a fundamentally unworkable statute in the way Nicole describes, it becomes the true world of crony capitalism. Right? As Nicole said, despite all the bluster, nobody really believes that Dodd-Frank gets rid of too big to fail. As far as we could tell, there's not been a lot of studies on this, but as far as we could tell, the too big to fail subsidy is still there, which means that big banks can raise money in capital markets cheaper and get a competitive advantage against small banks. The pure regulatory cost of Dodd-Frank is choking off small banks. That basically, to hire another dozen or two lawyers at J.P. Morgan Chase is a rounding error. To hire hire another lawyer or two for a community bank with 12 employees is a big hit on the bottom line. And so what we're seeing is community banks are going under in large part, or merging in large part, just because of the regulatory cost of Dodd-Frank. Not to mention, as I was saying, a lot of them are just simply leaving the mortgage lending market, for instance, recognizing that you can't make loans in this kind of environment in which you can't predict your liability. The CFPB also has the power to go after unfair, deceptive, and abusive practices or products. Not defined anywhere. Unfair and deceptive have historic definitions in the FTC, but it's not clear where they're going to fall. Abusive is a completely new term that nobody knows what it means, and the director of the CFPB has said, I am not going to do rulemaking on abusive. I'm going to define it by enforcement, right? Which means you will find out after the fact whether or not we think that what you've done is abusive, right? And that's the kind of world that we live in. So who succeeds in that world? Obviously the big banks, right? Obviously the big banks are the ones who can hire the lawyers and the lobbyists to be able to work through the system. They're the ones benefited by the too big to fail subsidy. And I think one of the great ironies of Dodd-Frank is going to actually end up promoting consolidation of the banking industry and making the too big to fail banks even too much bigger to fail, right? And Washington likes this as well, right? Think, for example, back to the auto bailout. And I don't know if you remember this, but one of the things during the Chrysler bailout, basically what happened was they plundered the secured creditors in Chrysler, you may remember. Well, a lot of those bonds were held by big banks. Do we think big banks just usually roll over when a company wants to take them to the hoop in bankruptcy? No. Why did they? Do you think it has anything to do with the fact that they were on welfare from the government because they give them tens of billions of dollars of bailout money? I think so. Yeah. I mean, and that's basically what we see in Dodd-Frank is this insinuation of the government in turning, if you want to take the auto dealers example as a good example, turning the private sector, turning the banks into arms of the federal government to basically do off-balance sheet sort of social engineering, right? And that's basically the way that this works. You may not know, for instance, in the auto bailouts, there's a specific provision that basically said if Chrysler met a certain goals for green cars, Fiat would automatically get more stock in the company, right? They're basically engaging in environmental planning through the process of the bailout. So my remaining time, what can we do about this? What can we do about this? Well, one of the things I would say is first, I was very disappointed and disheartened by the complete lack of spine by the judiciary during the financial crisis. And it makes me very nervous about the future of the rule of law in the country, that even the Supreme Court refused to stop the auto bailout and later went back and vacated the opinion. But I have very little confidence of the judiciary to stand up for the rule of law in a time of financial crisis. I think, secondly, politics is not likely to help either. Rahm Emanuel said it best, right? Never let a good crisis go to waste. The purpose of the rule of law is to constrain politicians in special interest. And what we saw during the financial crisis was basically rampant overrunning the rule of law, for whom the benefit of the politicians and in the special interest. I think one of the things we might have to think about is more dramatic constitutional type reforms. Perhaps it's higher capital requirements. Perhaps in the world of the second best, we have to think about breaking up the big banks. If we think, as I think may be possible, that we can't stop bailouts, that the political temptation of bailouts may just be too great. Let me say the final thing then about what this, two final things, which is I think that when it comes to this interrelationship of big business and big government, I think this is what Obamanomics really is. It's not really so much about socialism as it about corporatism, right? It's big government, big business, and big labor in bed together, carving up the economy and distributing it the way that they like, turning big business into an instrumentality to deliver social services, as we see with banks and that sort of thing. I think the final thing that bothers me about all this is that one of the things we learned from this experience, I think it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle, which is when we allow breaches of the rule of law and the Constitution during the crisis under a claimed perceived necessity, we don't roll it back after. We didn't roll it back after the Great Depression, and we didn't roll it back after the financial crisis. What happens is the politicians, as we see in Dodd-Frank, swoop in and they basically consolidate it. Dodd-Frank isn't a law. It's 2,400 pages of codified discretion and basically telling bureaucrats to do whatever they want to. It may look like a law, but it's not a law. There are certain people who benefit from that and certain people who don't, and the certain people who benefit from that are going to dig in and protect it. Thanks.
Good. Thank you for that help on the constitutional aspects of Dodd-Frank and recognizing also the parallels between the crisis atmosphere in the Great Depression and the expansion of the federal government there, and similarly, the expansion of the government under the housing crisis with the Dodd-Frank bill. How much time do we have, Anita?
We have a good 15 plus minutes.
15 plus minutes, good. We have time for questions. Are Gina and Laura ready? Yes, good. We have questions. As moderator, I have only one request, that your question be shorter than the answer. Thank you.
I didn't hear any of the panelists talk a whole lot, I don't think, about the role of the credit rating cartel of Standard & Poor's, Moody's, Fitch, and I wonder if you could comment on the role that they played issuing all these AAA ratings to steaming piles of subprime junk for which they've been sued over. And going forward, whether you think there should be a role, whether we even need credit rating agencies, and if so, how they should be paid, what kind of relationship they should have with the institutions whose stuff they are rating, and a way to somehow make credit rating work better than it apparently worked during this crisis.
I'd like to comment to that very pertinent question. In the longer version of my speech, I mentioned that. Of course, this was a part of the crony capitalist system. Imagine that Consumer Reports suddenly becomes the government's arm for approving whatever you can buy. And that whatever let's say if a bank is going to give you any credit toward a purchase, that it has to be approved by Consumer Reports. So Consumer Reports then becomes the government's designated credit rater. And then, of course, imagine on top of that, that the government has a particular stake in your buying certain goods and services, like, let's say, by analogy, they want you to buy things for your new home because they've been encouraging you to buy new homes. Now, of course, that's exactly what did happen. Standard & Poor's, the other credit raters, became the government designated approved credit rating agency, so that it was therefore impossible for you and me to get into the business because we're not government approved. That was part of the crony capitalist system. We're not government approved. And then, on top of that, anybody who worked for the credit, there were in fact some people who worked for the credit rating agencies, as indeed there were people who worked for Fannie and Freddie who were pretty appalled at what was going on. But what are you going to do? Become a whistleblower? When Barney Frank and Chris Dodd and Bill Clinton and later George W. Bush are going to come down and are going to have your head if you don't give this junk a AAA rating? So obviously the answer, of course, to the question is we don't want credit raters to become a part of the crony capitalist system. By the way, I don't think it matters too much about who pays for the credit rating, because obviously if we have a free market in raters, and I can even imagine a market in which we're not especially interested. Certainly hedge funds, funds with a lot of money are going to do their own rating and their own evaluation, but there could be a market for it, just like there's a market for Consumer Reports. Probably Consumer Reports and other consumer raters would be far more dominant if we didn't imagine that the federal government is doing some of that evaluation for us. We know it's not really. We know it's basically in bed with its own cronies. But indeed, it was an important part of the story, but fits very well with the simple narrative that this was capitalism, crony capitalism at work. But getting back again to your question, do we want credit raters? Well, does the market want credit raters? Probably it does. Leave it to the market. Certainly there's a long tradition of people who evaluate things for us, for different institutions, and post those ratings and stand by them. I certainly think that we are told that we're too dumb to buy medical care, that we need these surrogates who are supposedly smarter than we are, who are buying it for us and obviously wasting a lot of our money in the process and buying a lot of things for us that we don't really need. So I think that clearly maybe we're better than they, a little smarter than they about what we really want to spend. But certainly there would be, I think you and I should start a web service called secondopinion.com. You go to a doctor, then you do want a second opinion. You want another evaluator. It's very, very natural. One of the glories of our society is that we have certification. We need to buy brands. We need to trust brands. We need evaluators. The market sorts that out very well without government intervention.
Thank you. Nicole, do you have anything to add?
I would just say one of the reasons that many investors were so intent on getting these AAA ratings was that they had to have, the financial institutions could hold less capital against instruments that had the AAA rating. So another false incentive to look at the rating and not the wizardry behind the rating. They had to hold less capital behind these investments, and therefore they could make a higher profit on them.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I agree with both those. I mean, it has to do with the capital requirements. So, for instance, another beautiful example is Greek sovereign bonds. I think were also AAA because for banks to be able to hold those. But I do think that the rating agencies were really important in getting people to buy these things. And one of the things related to that I just wanted to mention that it sort of prompts is a lot of people have said that securitization was a big part of this, and for many reasons I don't think that's right. But one of the things I think is funny about it is yes, home mortgages were securitized, but does anybody know why home mortgage? Everybody says, well, it's not like the old days in which banks kept their mortgages after they wrote them, right? Do you know we got rid of that system? The savings and loan scandal. And you know what, the problems, you know what they decided when basically interest rates went up and mortgages were all at like 4% and they had to go out and raise capital at 12% or whatever the case was. Everybody said, oh, the government said, oh, the problem is you're holding all these mortgages. You need to get rid of all of them. So that's why they came up with securitization. Dodd-Frank has solved the problem though. Dodd-Frank says, you need to hold 5% of the mortgages. They've got it's like Baby Bear's bed, right? They've come up with exactly the right amount. They say, nobody knows what 5% means. We'll find that out through the rulemaking process. But it kind of shows sort of the Washington mentality.
Good, thanks. Next. Yeah, is that fine? Laura?
I'm Cor from Sterling College, and I think I have practiced real estate for 10 years and has been teaching for 17 years, 10 years at Texas A&M, 7 years in Sterling College. And I think the panel is extremely good with the information. But I disagree with the information that the securitized securities are not a problem. It was a big problem. The CMOs was a big problem. I think the Frank Dodd and the 2008 crisis, the Frank Dodd actually created a big, complicated bomb to kill a very elusive rat. I think that's what it is, elusive rats. The problems, they can't define the problems. Rats.
Rats.
Big bomb
Rats,
to kill
right.
some rats. Right.
If you look at the statistics, the U.S. abstract, from 2000 to 2006, the value of housing increased from about 5 trillion to 10 trillion, which is huge increase. And number two, so that's a problem. Number two, the derivatives was very, very complicated. I had a board member who was involved in this business. He said that nobody understood what it is. And number three, the subprime crisis. Loans will make to people below 620 or 620 and below, all right? So to solve the problem, I don't think there's a need for the Frank Dodd in my perspective. There's no need for Frank Dodd Act in my perspective. And you can see this in other countries. I think the solution is to adjust the loan to value so that the investor has a skin on it. That's number one. Number two is to raise the credit score in such a way that, again, people have a skin in it. And the third thing is trying to understand and manage the derivatives risks that a lot of investors and even bankers do not understand. And lastly, I have a question for you. What do you think about the quantitative easing? Will that create another problems that we have?
May I comment? First of all, I think I basically agree with what you said about the ways in which people with low FICO scores were given mortgages, the ways in which people were given mortgages with 1% and 2% down payments, with what was called no docs. You know, what is there's the ninja no income, no job. That was another great standard of giving people mortgages. And it was all, as I said, the capitalist system's doing. In a system of capitalism, we want to bring back the banker we love to hate. The banker who would not give you the mortgage because you didn't have a job for long enough or because your credit history wasn't good enough. Indeed, a number of years ago, I was involved with the public broadcasting system, and they did a documentary in the 1970s in which they inveighed against that banker we love to hate. Bankers were not giving enough people mortgages. They were being very cruel to people who they didn't think were credit worthy. And that was a big problem. Now, of course, we hate another kind of banker, the crony capitalist banker, who is a creature of the government. Because again, only the government can do that. The profit and loss system is never going to do that. Now, of course, you're right that what we need to do is restore character, credit, and quality. Those are actually standards. There was a certain pride among credit analysts in mortgages who did evaluate people properly. And of course, you want to give a mortgage. This is what you do for a living. It's a profitable business. It is a collateralized loan, but you want to do it prudently. And when the government was, when Clinton and Barney Frank were pounding on the system and on Fannie and Freddie to buy mortgages that were given to people far below the median income, that's what inevitably happened. Now, when you mention securitization, there's no question. It is a little bit of a puzzle as to whether we would have had securitization in this market if the government had not been involved. Certainly, Fannie and Freddie were a big engine of securitization, and certainly, as Todd was saying, the savings and loan was a reaction to it. But I don't know if you as an experienced person in business would necessarily say that derivatives are always bad. I know Warren Buffett famously talked about how derivatives were weapons of mass destruction. We just heard from such a weapon, I guess. I don't know if that was, but Warren Buffett was a guy who actually bought derivatives. Options and futures are derivatives. I would suggest to you that to object to securitization. Securitization obviously has its good points and its bad points. There is a very nice idea that if you take on the mortgage, you're evaluating the customers. You know that person a little bit better than anybody else does. That idea of It's a Wonderful Life, where you're giving to the people you know and love. That's a great model. But certainly in a healthy market, it's possible to evaluate, to bring in even more capital with securitization. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it. In a way, to object to derivatives is really just a matter of shooting the messenger. And then you asked a larger question about quantitative easing, which is a massive point. I personally don't believe. I believe that quantitative easing has done very little. Just to make a simple assertion, I believe that. Think of it this way: what is the government really doing? It's buying bonds with printed money in order to keep the interest rate low, in order to drive bond prices up and keep the interest rate low. Think of it another way. Let's say the government had a different kind of quantitative easing. Let's say it was buying stocks. Let's say it was moving massive amounts of money into the stock market in order to push prices up. I would think probably we'd all agree that its initial impact of doing so would be to pull prices up. But then ultimately, wouldn't the fundamentals rule? If companies aren't really making profits, or they are making some profits, wouldn't the stock market eventually sort of level itself and begin to reflect real fundamentals? Eventually, the stock market does reflect fundamentals. And so I would suggest to you that by analogy, really what the government, because Bernanke and Greenspan and the rest of them just want to be in front of the limelight, doing something, getting involved with something, they brought about this quantitative easing of buying bonds in order to push down interest rates. I don't know if it's having much of an effect. I do think that the unwinding of it is probably going to be somewhat destabilizing. But we didn't come to talk about quantitative easing, and I shouldn't perhaps have gotten into it. I hope that I more or less answered your questions from my standpoint. I hand it over to my colleagues to pick it up. Sorry.
Who have 30 seconds.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. Nicole?
Yeah.
Yes, I agree that securitization introduced a new risk. Securitization introduced equity risk into long-term bond markets, and that is not a good thing. The idea behind this approach, which is not novel, we've been securitizing things for 45 years, and this was a Fannie Freddie innovation along with Wall Street firms. Was instead of an investor lending money for a mortgage, keeping it on the books for 30 years, you could package up hundreds of thousands of mortgages into one security. The security was like a stock. It was liquid. If you got tired of this mortgage, you didn't have to wait 30 years. You could sell this investment of mortgages to another investor that moment and at the price that you were expecting. Well, the problem is by making mortgages into liquid investments, you take the risk that they behave like liquid investments, which is to become illiquid sometimes. The economy can stand a drop in the stock market. Economy withstood it in 1987 and many times before and after that. The economy cannot withstand the same type of precipitous drop in the long-term credit markets. You can't have one day where everyone wants to buy mortgages and one day where everyone wants to sell them. And so this introduces another risk of bailouts because you've introduced volatility into this market. And the answer probably does go back to the capital requirements. You can't treat banks differently than you treat another type of investor. Have a lot of capital behind these things and also behind the mortgages that are behind these things. Quantitative easing is a bad idea. And let me introduce one other thing, because we hear a lot about the issue of encouraging home ownership among people with low credit ratings or people with low incomes. And I just want to remind people that, while that is true, the problem that grew up because it is a middle class entitlement, and it is largely on a nationwide basis an upper middle class entitlement. New York, California, Washington, the rest of the Northeast, relatively affluent Americans have gotten this notion that the value of their home should increase every year above inflation and above population. They have put all of their money and much of other people's money into this asset. It would be easy to fix this problem if it was a poverty problem. It is not easy because it is a middle-class entitlement, just like Medicare more than Social Security and other middle-class entitlements that are hard to get rid of. People expect a cheap mortgage. They've expected a cheap mortgage since the early days, or the middle days of the Reagan administration, and they're going to be very upset when and if they learn this is not something that the government should provide.
Give Todd 1 minute. I'm going to be up here with a hook if he goes longer.
1 minute. I just want to comment on one last thing, which is on with respect to consumers. The narrative that came out of Dodd-Frank is that there were all these hapless consumers who got screwed by the banks, right? That we sort of know that whole thing, the sort of borrower's victim sort of narrative. But next to that is this whole other view that Gene was describing, which is that if I'm a bank, I make you an interest-only mortgage with nothing down, and your house goes down in value by $50,000, and you walk away from that loan, that's probably the best investment you're going to ever make in your life, right? You're just rationally responding to incentives. And what we know is that most foreclosures were that. Foreclosures have been caused by people whose homes were underwater. Now, sure, there were people who got defrauded and that sort of thing, but a lot of foreclosures are caused by people whose homes were underwater. Now, if you rationally respond to incentives, whatever that is, it's not a consumer protection problem, and it's not you being a victim, right? And what we've done is we've created a whole edifice based on the idea that people are victims, when in fact, many of these people were not victims. And we're creating a whole set of problems, moral hazard problems, and all kind of problems by buying into that mentality in our regulation.
Thank you. Todd. Good. Yeah. And I thank our panelists, Gene, Nicole, and Todd, for illuminating a complicated bill. Thank you.